Today we will discuss carbohydrates. Do you ever think that a student quietly studying a textbook is aware that within his brain cells billions of glucose molecules are splitting to provide the energy that permits him to learn? Glucose provides nearly all of the energy the human brain uses daily. Similarly, a marathon runner bursting across the finish line in an explosion of sweat and triumph seldom gives thanks to the glycogen fuel her muscles have devoted to help her finish the race. Together, glucose and its storage from glycogen provide about half of all the energy muscles and other body tissues use. The other half of the body's energy comes mostly from fat. People do not eat glucose and glycogen directly. Glycogen is the animal storage form of glucose. They eat foods rich in carbohydrates. Do not eat glucose and glycogen directly. They only eat foods rich in carbohydrates. Their bodies convert the carbohydrates mostly into glucose for immediate energy and into glycogen for reserve energy. All plant foods, whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and fruits provide ample carbohydrate. Milk also contains carbohydrates. Many people mistakenly think of carbohydrate as fattening and avoid them when trying to lose weight. Such a strategy may be helpful if the carbohydrates are the simple sugars of candy bars and cookies. But if the carbohydrates are the complex carbohydrates of whole grain, vegetables, and legumes, this strategy will not be working. First thing, you have to understand what is carbohydrate. Carbohydrate family include the simple carbohydrates, the sugars, and the complex carbohydrate, which is the starches and fiber. To understand the structure of carbohydrate, look at the units of which they are made. Each item can form a certain number of chemical bonds with other items. Carbon atoms can form 4 bonds, nitrogen atoms 3, oxygen atom 2, hydrogen atoms only 1. Only 4 main types of the atoms found in the nutrients are hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Each atom has a characteristic number of bonds it can form with other atoms. You can see here a graphical representation of carbohydrate classification. Carbohydrates are classified into 4 subclasses. First classification is monosaccharides, which is further classified in glucose, fructose, and galactose, which is the examples of monosaccharide. Second classification of carbohydrates are disaccharides. Sucrose, lactose, maltose are the examples of disaccharides. Third classification of carbohydrates are oligosaccharides. Raffinose and starchinose are the examples of the oligosaccharides. Polysaccharides are the last carbohydrate classification, which represents the starches, glycogen, and cellulose. What are the monosaccharides? Monosaccharide is the first classification of carbohydrates Monosaccharides, three monosaccharides are important in nutrition. All have the same numbers and kinds of atom, but all are in different arrangements of the atoms. These chemical differences account for the differencing sweetness of the monosaccharide. A pinch of purified glucose on the tongue gives only a mild sweet flavor, and galactose hardly tastes sweet at all. But fructose is an intensively sweet as honey, and is the sugar responsible for honey's sweetness. Glucose, fructose, and galactose. These are three types of monosaccharide. Glucose is a larger and more complicated molecule than the ethyl alcohol, but it obeys the same rules of chemistry. Each carbon atom has four bonds, each oxygen has two bonds, each hydrogen has one bond. It is the structure of the glucose. The structure of glucose has to be drawn flat, but in nature, the five carbons and oxygens are roughly in a plane. The atoms attached to the ring, carbons, extended above and below the plane. The diagram of a glucose molecules shows all the relationship between the atoms and proves symbol on examination. This figure shows how the chemical structure of glucose can be simplified by combining or omitting several symbols and still convey the same information. Glucose, commonly known as blood sugar, serves as an essential energy source for all the body's activity. Its significance to nutrition is tremendous. Glucose is one of the two sugars in every disaccharide and polysaccharide starch molecule. Starch is the chief food source of energy for the world's people, and other is glycogen, is an important storage form of energy in the body. Glucose is a simple sugar with the molecular formula C6H12O6. Glucose is the most abundant monosaccharide. Glucose is mainly made by the plants and most algae during photosynthesis from water and carbon dioxide, using energy from sunlight, where it is used to make cellulose in cell walls, the most abundant carbohydrates in the world. The glucose is the most important source of energy in all organisms. Glucose for metabolism is stored as a polymer in plants, mainly as starch and amylopectin, and in animals as glycogen. Glucose circulates in the blood of animals as blood sugar. The naturally occurring form of glucose is D-glucose, while L-glucose is produced synthetically in comparatively small amounts and is less biologically active. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Glucose molecule can exist in an open chain as well as ring form. Glucose is naturally occurring and is found in its free state in fruits and other parts of plants. Glucose is released from the breakdown of the glycogen in a process known as glycogenolysis. Glucose forms white or colorless solids that are highly soluble in water and acidic but poorly soluble in methanol and ethanol. Glucose is usually present in solid form as a monohydrate with a glucose closed pyrene ring. The open chain form of glucose makes up less than 0.02% of the glucose molecules in an aqueous solution. The rest is one of two cyclic hemiacetal forms. In its open chain form, the glucose molecule has an open unbranched backbone of 6 carbon atoms, where C1 is part of an aldehyde group. Glucose is also classified as an aldose, aldohexose. The aldehyde group makes glucose a reducing sugar, giving a positive reaction with the Verhelling test. The open chain of the open chain form of glucose exists with several cyclic isomers, each containing a ring of carbon closed by one oxygen atom. More than 99% of glucose molecules exist as pyranose form. The open chain form is limited to about 0.25%, and furanose forms exist in negligible amounts. The term glucose and D-glucose are generally used for these cyclic form as well.